It's cold. War in here? Check out your class notes for chapter 22. You got two sets of class notes. We got to go quick. Cold War begins. Why was it called the Cold War? Because it's cold in Russia, right? Wrong. No, it's because this is going to be a war that is not going to involve a direct battle between the United States and its Cold War adversary, the USSR. But we'll have to get to some stuff before we can actually get to that fun. First things first, let's talk about this new United Nations. The United Nations was formed at the end of World War II to create a body of nations. That's why it's called the United Nations, to work to prevent future global wars. We tried the League of Nations in the past, although I guess we shouldn't say we because the United States wasn't in the League of Nations. The United States is in the United Nations, and the goal is, hey, World War II is like the worst thing that's ever happened to the world, so let's not do that one again. So therefore, the United Nations was formed to prevent future global wars. Also on the feel-good front is the Geneva Convention. Now, the Geneva Convention had been around before. I want to say it's going back to like the 1870s, somewhere thereabouts. Um, they would meet periodically and add new accords to the Geneva Convention. They dealt with a variety of things, but for our sake, the one thing I need you to understand is they dealt with treatment of prisoners of war because the Geneva Convention was not followed during World War II, especially in the Pacific. Okay, excuse me. The treatment of prisoners in the Pacific Theater, especially you would think the Bataan Death March, reflected the savagery of the fighting there. It did not line up so much with the Geneva Conventions. It was better in Europe, but not perfect. So in 49, the Geneva Convention lay out exactly really what you cannot do to a prisoner of war. So think prisoner of war when you think the Geneva Convention. All right, partitioning of Germany. You are looking at a map of Germany after World War II. And you can see that it's divided up into sectors. The country is divided up into sectors as well as its capital city of Berlin. This is the partitioning of Germany. And basically, at the end of World War II, Stalin and Roosevelt and others decided, well, how are we going to let Europe get back together? And what the basic promise was, we're going to let the countries develop their own forms of government. We're not going to force ourselves. Well, generally speaking, the United States, Great Britain, France did not do that. However, Russia did. Aggressive actions in Romania and in Poland were basically where let's say, a non-communist, a democratic election was held, and Stalin would not recognize the person, would not seat the person, wanted to force communism. Well, it was forced in East Germany. This is the Russian zone. It was forced in East Berlin. Pretty soon, what you have is a battle between East and West. West Germany is going to be democratic and resumed self-government, but East Germany is under the domination of the Soviet Union, did not adapt democratic institutions. Okay. In general, though, after the war, the Soviet forces are going to occupy most of Eastern and Central Europe, including the eastern portions of Germany. So these Eastern European countries and some Central European countries, the big one is Russia, communist, but they have what are called satellite countries, so the smaller countries. So if you're looking at Europe, Asia, you kind of go right side, communist, generally speaking, left side, democratic. We'll show you a map in a bit, in a bit, in a bit, in a bit. But battle that we're going to talk about in a second in Germany is going to really kickstart what's known as the Cold War. Cold War lasts from 1946, so after World War II, until 1990. The Cold War ends when the Soviet Union ends, which is in 1990. The United States is going to represent democratic political institutions and free market economic system of capitalism, where the Soviet Union is going to have a totalitarian government with a communist economic system. Okay, well, how is our president, who at the time is Harry S. Truman, going to deal with this? Well, he has a policy of containment, meaning there's no need to have that direct war. It could be World War III because there's nuclear weapons involved. instead contain communism. That's part of the Truman Doctrine. Here's what the Truman Doctrine says. One, prevent communism from spreading instead of attacking communist countries. So let it be. Let it be. If it spreads, attack and defend the people that are fighting the spread of it. So if North Korea invades South Korea, go. If North Vietnam invades South Vietnam, go. But don't go to Russia. Don't go to Moscow to fight the Cold War. That is containment. And the idea of containment is that eventually, if it's left alone, the communist country will fall apart. Okay? So we're going to resist communist aggression in other countries. And we're primarily going to do it in Korea and in Vietnam. Also, provide post-war economic assistance to counter Soviet expansion. That's called the Marshall Plan. Basically, we lent a whole heck of a lot of financial aid. We gave money to Europe to rebuild European economies and to prevent the spread of communism. So here's the fear. The fear is if these countries in here, if their government starts to fall apart, their economy goes bad, that they will switch to communism. So to stop that from happening, the United States provided tons of money, okay, and this was named after our Secretary of State, George Marshall. So the Marshall Plan put money in, okay. Berlin Airlift, one of the first aggressive moves that Stalin makes is he blocks access to West Berlin because, of course, he's not going to like West Berlin. It's in his sector. It's democratic, blah, blah, blah. So the United States actually drops supplies, fuel, food, and candy, hashtag HFE, using the bombers that were used to bomb Germany during World War II. Berlin Airlift works. Stalin releases the blockade, and the West Berliners are safe. Okay, defense alliances are formed. What a defense alliance means is there's a group of countries. Let's pretend there's 10 countries, and country number 1 gets attacked. That means all of the other countries are going to rush in and go to war in defense of the country that got attacked. Everything that is shaded, these are the NATO countries, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was formed with the United States and Western European countries to prevent a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Well, Soviet responded with their own. You can see it here in red. The Warsaw Pact. Soviet allies in Eastern Europe formed the Warsaw Pact after West Germany joined NATO. Okay? For 50 years, this is the battle. This is East versus West. This is the Cold War. Okay? Now, a big victory for the communists in the Cold War is going to be the Chinese Revolution, led by Mao Zedong. American fears of communist domination all over the world increased because China, a gigantic country, especially in terms of population, goes communist. And a bunch of people are saying to themselves, how do we let this happen? If we're talking about containment, how did Mao Zedong totally take over China and make it go communist? Okay. So the next fear was, well, I wonder if Japan is going to go communist. Following the war, Japan was occupied by American forces, but soon after, Japan is actually going to adopt a democratic form of government and become a strong ally of the United States. We beefed up our resources and our aid to Japan, and Japan's government today is modeled after our government, and they're going to become a strong ally of the United States after World War II. Okay? All right. Now the second part. Here comes the big war. Here comes the Korean War. The best thing to look at the Korean War are these maps. Okay? North Korea, communist country, invades South Korea, who was a democratic country. The United Nations got involved. But when we talk about the United Nations sending troops in the Korean War, the vast majority are going to be United States troops. Now look, North Korean drives, see these arrows, drives the South Korean into the bottom right part of the peninsula. Then, in charge of the war is going to be General MacArthur. Leads a daring invasion, landing right here in the Incheon Reservoir, driving back the North Korean troops. They go all the way up to the top, but remember, China gets involved because China is communist. China sends in hundreds of thousands of troops, which drive the UN, really US troops, a little bit south of the 38th parallel, which divides the two countries. Now, MacArthur is not happy. He says the way to win this war is to use nuclear weapons on China. President Truman says, I don't want to do that. No. Then MacArthur starts publicly criticizing Truman. So Truman says, well, I'm the commander-in-chief. I control the military. You're talking bad about me. You are fired for gross insubordination. After he is fired, 2 years afterwards, Matthew Ridgway takes over and he leads a little bit of a push, and then a stalemate happens, meaning nothing is really changing, and an armistice is signed. An armistice is not a treaty that ends the war. An armistice simply means that the fighting is over. People debate, did the United States win the Korean War, lose the Korean War? Was it a tie? Well, that's up to you. But what you do have to know is that South Korea is going to remain democratic and free. The communist occupation did not happen. So in that way, containment was a success. Okay? End of Truman's presidency is not very good. Think about it. Here's 3 bad things that happened at the end. 1, remember, China went communist. 2, Korea was a stalemate, started to get pretty unpopular. And 3, in 1949, the Soviet Union detonated their first nuclear weapon. Oh, that's going to be a big problem, because if the Cold War has 2 countries with nuclear weapons, then there is the threat of them using them. How did they get it in 49? I mean, we had the best scientists, we had the best materials. They got it like 4 years afterwards. How did... Oh, I don't know. Let's pick that up in 1 second. Truman is going to get replaced by General Eisenhower. General is important because in the Cold War, foreign policy is a major issue in every presidential election. Eisenhower's got an idea of how to contain communism. He's a containment guy, but he says the way to do it is massive retaliation, meaning threaten to use nukes if it looks like the communists are going to spread. That way you don't have to get into an actual war. You can just say, hey, for instance, let's pretend we're talking about Korea. Hey, North Korea, if you're going to step across that border, we are going to put a nuke all in your country. That's massive retaliation. It is to deter, that means stop, wars from occurring by threatening to use nuclear weapons. It's actually cheaper. You think, well, you got to get a lot of nukes, and he does get a lot of nukes. But it's cheaper because you don't have to maintain the big military. Ever heard the expression more bang for your buck? That comes straight out of the Cold War, and it comes out of the idea of massive retaliation as a defense form. Hey, I remember I said there were spies out there, didn't I? Well, here's one. You're looking at a guilty man. You're looking at Alger Hiss. He was a big-time diplomat, like really important, really well-known, had gone to a lot of the important conferences at the end of World War II. He was accused by Whittaker Chambers, who was the Time magazine editor, of being a spy, and he was found guilty of lying. Actually, the statute of limitations prevented him from being executed for espionage, but it is generally accepted that he was guilty of spying. Ooh, that's not good because that's a diplomat. How about these nice folks? Say hello to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They had a small role in the Manhattan Project. That was the project that built the first nuclear weapon in the United States. They weren't super involved, but they were involved enough to get access to documents. They were in a spy ring where they gave those documents to the Soviet Union, which likely helped them get their nuclear weapon. Now, the Rosenbergs, there was no statute of limitations. They were found guilty of espionage and they were executed, okay? All because of those atomic secrets. Now, in this era of fear, Joseph McCarthy rises to prevalence, playing off fear of communism. But Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, begins recklessly making accusations of communists. He went after government officials, American citizens, and even the United States military. He would also often use flimsy or no evidence whatsoever. The term McCarthyism means making false accusations based on rumor or guilt by associations. People were scared, though. That's why they believed some of the stuff McCarthy was saying, because the worry was of a nuclear weapon. Duck and cover drills were used to train children what to do in the case of a nuclear attack, and the government encouraged people to build bomb shelters. Virginia actually benefited a lot from the Cold War because of private defense contracting. In Northern Virginia, lots of companies benefited by having private defense contracts. In the Hampton Roads area, large naval and air bases were built. That is it. It is done. You need to do well on the test. Good job.